welcome to the programme, Charles. Thank you very much for joining.
Great to be here. Thank you.
We first met virtually just before COVID, and I'd read your first book, Being a Beast, and then COVID got in the way, and so I'm very pleased that now that we are getting back together, you've got another book out called Being a Human. But before we get into the your work as an author, I mean, you are, I think I'm right in saying you're a barrister, you're a vet, you're an academic, and you've written something like, someone mentioned to me, over 30 books. Is that correct?
It depends how you count, I suppose, but too many.
Too many. But I mean, it's a remarkably broad range of professional activities. And I think some would, there's an expression of, are you a fox or are you a hedgehog? A fox being someone who's able to draw from an eclectic array of traditions versus a hedgehog who's very deep but very narrow expertise. So I hope you don't mind me characterizing you more as a fox than a hedgehog. But I mean, I'm curious, how do you, two questions. I mean, such a diverse range of professional activities. I mean, how did you land on those? And secondly, I mean, how do you spend your time across those? Because they're all quite, I mean, I'm sure there are some connections, but they all feel quite unrelated as well, and quite challenging from a time perspective, I'd have thought.
So how did I land? Well, I was a passionate childhood naturalist, and the natural world has always been my inspiration. I've always gone back to the natural world when I've been hurt. I've always gone to the natural world when I wanted to be re-entranced. And so veterinary medicine was an obvious thing to do. So, at that time, I was labouring under the misapprehension that in order to understand the real nature of something, you needed to understand how the various parts worked, that you could understand something by cutting it up. And that's what veterinary medicine teaches you. And there are some insights that one can learn from a knowledge of the anatomy and the physiology of the distinct parts, but there are also lots of things that you miss by that analysis. And I became increasingly concerned that the vision of the natural world, which was so important to me, was not being captured by this reductionist, murdering, indissecting approach, which is the approach of medicine and veterinary medicine. And that took me increasingly into wondering how I should try to recapture that wonder, how I could get a better model of the world, one which accorded better with my intuitions about the extraordinariness of the place that we live, and that turned me increasingly philosophical. But you're right, I became a barrister, and that was encouraged by an epiphany when I was at university. I was studying veterinary medicine at the time, but I happened to go into the law library and I took out a law report, and I read this extraordinary set of stories about the way in which transcendental principles of the law tried to control the messy things that happened in bedrooms and in pubs, and that collision of the abstract, the transcendental, with the mess of real life, fascinated me, and to some extent it still fascinated me. Anyway, but practice at the bar was throwing up all the time, really fascinating ethical problems. And I got frustrated that I didn't have time to look as closely at those problems as I wanted to. And so I started writing about those problems and drifted increasingly into academia. So now I'm at the University of Oxford, and my academic life is mostly concerned with questions of identity and personhood, and what we can conclude about identity and personhood from dramatic medical situations where, for example, dementia strips us of lots of the attributes which we would normally use to describe us, or traumatic brain injury makes us a radically different person, apparently, from the one that we've always thought that we are. But although those activities might sound very disparate ones, I think it's all the same project. I think it's all the business of trying to decide what sort of creatures we are. I think there's a massive queasiness in modern humans about saying what sort of animals we are. And in the olden days, religions gave us satisfactory answers to those questions, or at least answers to those questions that we could work with, which gave us a sense of our dignity, which accorded with our own intuitions about our own importance. So I want to know what sort of creature I am, because it seems to me that I can't know what sort of creature I am unless I conduct a broad range of inquiries, and unless I know what sort of creature I am, how can I say meaningfully anything which involves a personal pronoun? How can I say to my wife and my children, I love you? How can I say this is my Charles Foster's set of political views? So I want to know what sort of creature I am. That's what it's all about.
And so
just you see that question through various lenses.
Yeah. Okay. So your academic, I mean, you didn't say, and I didn't specifically ask, but I mean, your academia draws on multiple disciplines, different disciplines, or are you associated with a particular department and have a certain label of academia on you, or are you trying to avoid that?
So I'm a member of the law faculty here at the University of Oxford, and as I said, my research there mostly concerns philosophical questions about identity and personhood and the adequacy of dignity and autonomy as decision-making principles, but viewed through the lens of horrible things that happen to people.
Yeah. Okay. And then the first book was Being a Beast, and the second book was Being a Human. And I think what's common about them is they're both deeply immersive experiences for you, as you, I mean, physically and literally, you sort of, the first book, Being a Beast, you lived as different animals to try and understand the world through their lenses. And then the second book, Being a Human, you lived as, the second book's more of a travel book, I guess, traveling back through three different time periods, as well as, I guess, traveling through, different, you were looking at the world through the eyes of your father and also your son as well. I mean, that was the other element of it. But is that I mean, you mentioned the key driver for the project is to understand more about you. Was exactly, I mean, having done Being a Beast, what were the questions that were left with you that you felt that you hadn't answered that got you into the next project, Being a Human?
I was aware in Being a Beast that I was trying to do something which in one way was ludicrously impossible. Yeah. Trying to think my way into the sensory world of something very different from me. But in another way, ludicrously simple, because the creatures that I was looking at are not as complex as human beings. So I wanted to try to learn the lessons about being a human that I had learnt in the apprenticeship which I'd served as part of the research for Being a Beast. So as you say, immersion. So having immersed myself in the worlds of badgers, foxes, red deer and so on in Being a Beast, I wondered what would happen if I used that same technique to try to immerse myself in the lives of my human forebears.
Which was harder? I'm curious. I mean, was it much harder the latter project, or because I mean, being a badger and literally sort of living in a hole and eating worms from a physical experience point of view struck me as being quite challenging. But I think, as we'll get into it, I mean, trying to throw yourself back into as a hunter gatherer, that felt far more sort of psychologically and emotionally harder. Is that...
It was much harder. So research for Being a Beast was enormous fun. It was fun and games with my family, crawling around on all fours, hang gliding, trying to be a swift, standing on the tops of trees and trying to enter their sensory worlds, and so on. But I was always aware that this was going to be a slam dunk failure. I was always aware that I wasn't going to get very far in this project. All that I was really looking for, knowing that I was going to fail massively, was some indication that a tiny little bit of otherness was going to be accessible. So the reasoning in Being a Beast was, look, if I can understand even a tiny bit about something as different from me as a badger or a fox, maybe I can have a conversation with my children and my best friends that isn't at cross purposes. Maybe I can get into their heads. And so trying to get into the heads of human ancestors was far more difficult, because there's a lot more, I think, going on in human heads, and there was a much greater psychological pressure to understand, because I knew that the consequences of that inquiry would impinge on the way that I live my life now in a much more immediate way. It was more difficult because humans, even ancient humans, can lie to us. It's part of their complexity. The cave paintings are not always telling a straightforward story. So I was burdened by the knowledge that whatever I discovered was bound to change me if I was going to be honest about it. And I was burdened by the ghosts of all these ancestors who were constantly wandering through my intellect and my imagination,
and appear on the pages, of course, as well,
and appear as literal ghosts on some of the pages.
Yeah. So I mean, let's start with, the first period of history is the Paleolithic period, and I think you characterize it as, if you're walking through a museum, tracing history, this is you get into a room where you see people, a nuclear family around a fire with a tool that's where the museum starts getting interesting. And this is the hunter-gatherer construct of society. And I'm going to get this is what, 30,000-40,000 years ago. And that's the kind of
40 to 50, maybe. Let's split the difference at 45,000. Yeah.
Okay. And
all of these human revolutions are not terribly speedy revolutions, and they happen at different times in different places of the world. But yeah, let's say 45.
And it was the beginning of, I suppose the archaeological record that you relied on some extent was the cave paintings, which is the time at which I think I heard you referring to it as the level of consciousness that had appeared and pronouns were beginning to be used by individuals, and that was characterized by the archaeological paintings, which were almost, I think you said, that's a travel journal or a travel book for man back in those days.
Yes. So the first observation to make is that my book, Being Human, like lots of books about the archaeology of early behaviorally modern humans, is a very Eurocentric book. So more and more we're recognizing that lots more happened earlier in Africa than we previously realized. But this ignition of behaviorally modern consciousness, probably happened in Europe at about say 45,000 or so years ago, and you can see it not in the very early phases in those cave paintings, but in, as you said, the transition from extremely boring, dowdy artifacts in the human evolution galleries to things which shout out I, and therefore have in them implicit the notion of the same sort of relationship with thou, as we recognize as central to modern human relationships, which are our defining characteristic. We are our relationships, and we see quite early depictions of the human figure. We see a desire to beautify artifacts, to indicate that there is something sacramental about our quotidian activities of eating and hunting. So we see an expression of our own moral significance embedded there in the very earliest traces of Upper Paleolithic life. And we also see hunter-gatherer wandering activities. So walking, journeying, constant transition from place to place, and no doubt from idea to idea. So it would seem to me that the business of simply putting one actual or metaphorical, one physical or figurative foot in front of one another all the time is part of what we mean when we say we're behaviorally modern. So humans are creatures who are constantly remaking themselves, who are seeing themselves as on a journey, each step of which takes them into new realms, each of which needs to be understood and respected. And the other really important thing that you see at this time is a recognition of the moral significance of everything else in the world, the non-human world. So it seems clear enough that although they might not have put it to themselves quite in this way, the whole of the non-human world was ensouled, which creates a terrible problem if you've got to eat. Mm-hmm. It means that whenever you're hungry, you have to desoul something else.
Yep.
And that requires, if you're ethical about it, a strenuous choreography of request to the animal that you allow it to be killed, of thanks to the animal that it has been allowed to be killed.
Compare that to. Sorry, I was going to interrupt you, Charles. I mean, compare that today. I mean, I was checking this number before. Every human being is not responsible, but basically there are 180 animals slaughtered per year per head of population on this planet.
Yeah.
So those two positions are rather different. I mean, you can't do that if you felt all the animals had souls, of course.
No, it puts a burden on us to justify very strenuously the way that we eat. So I'm not a vegetarian, but the death of an animal is not something that can be taken lightly. So we eat meat if there is something serious to be celebrated. Mm-hmm. And the equation goes, will the world, as a result of our celebration, be overall a better place, so much better a place that it outweighs the evil of killing this animal? And there's another utilitarian calculation going on, I suppose, as well, in relation to some of these animals. If there weren't the animal food industry, lots of animals that exist happily now and have, on balance, happy lives wouldn't exist. By denying them the opportunity to exist, you're diminishing the amount of happiness in the world. Therefore, let them live and kill them decently and eat them respectfully in order to maximize the amount of good in the world. But it is certainly not true that the life of a battery chicken contains more good than it does evil. Yeah,
well, and that might be one of the things we touch on, your visit to the slaughterhouse. And but let's go back to, so as you were entering this world, the world of hunter-gatherers, which I think is fair to say was probably the favourite place in the three time zones that you inhabited. Is that a fair characteristic or not?
It was the favourite place because I realised quite early on that I, like all humans, are at bottom hunter-gatherers, and returning to what we really are is an exciting and affirming, and for us modern people, exhilarating and sometimes shocking, but always formative experience. So I like doing it for that reason. I have a psychological aversion to being sedentary, and so I feared the later sedentary phases of the book. But the hunter-gatherer phase of that book is hugely longer than the subsequent phases. That's not just because I enjoyed researching and writing that section more. It's to reflect the far, far greater length of time that we spent as hunter-gatherers than anything else. Depending on how you do the calculation, it's between 75% to 95% of our time as humans. That's what we really are. Strip the suit off a Stuttgart banker and you find a hunter-gatherer beneath. That's what we really are. And it seems to me that our modern health, both psychological and physical and political and sociological, depends to a large extent on coming to terms with our hunter-gatherishness and on grafting that insight somehow into the way we live our modern lives. So it was a more urgent as well as a more congenial quest.
And your son, your 13-year-old son, I think at the time, I mean, he took to it like a duck to water, of course, like a fish to water or a duck to water, didn't he? I mean, it seemed to me that he was able to adapt far more quickly than you were to that environment. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Partly because he's a child, and as Plato said about knowledge, that the whole business of knowing anything is the process of unforgetting. So as we grow older as human beings, we forget more and more and more about what things are really like and what things are really for. I suppose the whole process of the Romantic movement was the process of making ourselves children again, giving ourselves childlike but not childish eyes with which to see the world. So yeah, Tom, not having my pretensions as an adult about the way the world is, not having my delusional self-confidence about my ability to construe the world, was better able to see it. But also, he's more plastic than I am, as a 13-year-old, therefore more adaptable. But also, he has the glorious gift of dyslexia. So he doesn't construe the world in linguistic terms in the same way that I do. So I'm sitting at my desk in Oxford at the moment, and I'm looking out at a tree. And as I look at that tree, I get some visual images from it, which are hitting my retina, and I'm translating those visual images almost immediately into things that have nothing to do with that actual tree. So remembered fragments of poems about trees, remembered physiological facts about trees. But I'm not really looking at that tree. Tom, because of his dyslexia, doesn't do that. He doesn't live in a linguistic world, which is a self-referential and self-reverential world. He lives in the real world. Tom, if he looked out of the window, would see the tree in a way that I can't. And I think that was how people acted in the first few thousand years of modern human consciousness. Yes, they had language, but language wasn't tyrannous. It was a tool for them. They used it to represent the world rather than it, language, or the nerdish left hemisphere, or however you want to put it, telling them how the world should be, dictating the terms with which they should perceive the world. So Tom was, as well as being fantastic company, a great research tool. And I had alongside me something that was someone who was very similar to an upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherer cognitively. And he's also much better at the practical things than I am. He's also much better at building shelters. He's much better at skinning rabbits. He's much more patient in collecting berries. All the skills which hunter-gatherers needed to have in order to survive.
Yeah. No, well, you've answered my first question, which was this quote. I was going to ask the question, your quote, "I've never seen a tree, never seen a dog, at least as an adult," but you've answered that, so we check that question off my list. But I mean, I've always thought it's interesting. I mean, you know, one of my questions towards the end of this will be, what can individuals sitting perhaps in you know, at their workplace today, what can they take from your inquiry? Because I've always found the kind of work that I've been drawn to has got far more the characteristics of hunter-gatherer work than the more structured, process-oriented, sedentary management work, for instance. I'm talking in the corporate world, but I mean, for me, hunter-gatherer, it's sales, it's business development, it's mergers and acquisitions, it's project-based work where you felt that you weren't suffocated and had to do something for 3 years before the next thing came along. But I'm not sure how far the analogy goes, or how far that one can take that frame of reference into the world of work, because it's changing so quickly and everyone's experience is different, I guess.
Yes, but the business has been constantly on the move. The business of coping with an entirely new environment every step of the way is a very modern corporate and hunter-gatherer way of looking at things.
Yeah. So I mean, so then let's move to the next phase, because I mean, we're on this. It feels to me that you become, or we become as humans, more suffocated. There's more structure put in place. There's more. I won't say evils, but certainly, some of the sort of the social hierarchies are imposed. Ownership is imposed as we move from the hunter-gatherer Paleolithic world to the Neolithic world. More social divisions, more. The word progress is, which I know you're going to respond quite. I've heard in previous interviews you've given that you've got quite a strong view on the word progress. But can you talk a little bit about that, the journey, both sort of your physical journey from Paleolithic into Neolithic, and what that actually was? What are some of the themes that were coming out of that?
Well, the physical journey was coming out of the woods, stopping wandering, going back into an agricultural society, and seeing in various places in the world what the business of agriculture had done to our relationship with the natural world and our relationship with ourselves. So in the Upper Paleolithic phase, we had seen ourselves as part of the natural world. We hadn't seen ourselves as in any way masters of it, although there were circumstances which we've discussed in which it was legitimate to crop the natural world. We were always very conscious that the natural world was ultimately going to crop us, that we were going to be eaten by the worms, which sometimes we had eaten. Our relationship with the non-human world changed radically with the Neolithic revolution. So I postulate in the book that that revolution, wrong word really, might have come about when fire was used on a big scale in order to clear forest for the grazing of animals, because you were killing huge amounts of animals at a time. It just wasn't possible to go through the necessary liturgy in order to say, please can I kill you, and thank you for letting me kill you, if you're destroying things on such an enormous scale. So there needed to be a radical realignment of humans' relationship with the natural world, and the obvious one, whether or not it involved the invocation of a sky god who could give you the necessary forgiveness for what you've done, or whether it didn't involve the invocation of such god, led to the notion that humans were different from the things which they were destroying, that they were in a situation of control, of mastery over these things. It gave us, in one stroke, or probably several strokes over several thousand years, but it came to the same thing, a sense of our own importance. It was a hubristic moment, and we all know what happens if you're hubristic. A nemesis ultimately happens, and goodness, aren't we seeing that nemesis now? So if you have a notion of yourself as a master over the things of the forest, what more natural than to think, oh, I can have mastery over and control over the women in my clan. So you have sexual division, you have social hierarchies of a sort that are very rare in much more egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies. You have war, partly, I'm sure, as a result of this notion of control, partly as a result of reliance on one or a few crops. In the hunter-gatherer world, if you failed to catch the caribou at that particular mountain pass that year, you just moved to a different food source. You were a brilliant naturalist. You had a massive ecological smorgasbord on which to graze. Your eggs literally weren't in one basket. When we come to the agricultural world, if your harvest failed in your fields near Jericho, you would starve unless you took your flint-tipped spears and went to take the bounty of the harvest from your neighbours across the hill. So we get lots of things coming together, hierarchies, war, and because communities got larger, we also have the birth of all the diseases which have taken such a toll on mankind. You have epidemics of lots of infectious diseases. You have dental caries. You have industrial disability of various kinds, as the women typically are sitting all day grinding. We see arthritis from repetitive activities for the first time in their skeletons. We see us, and it's really not a very pretty picture.
And this is when I think medieval superstitions start appearing. Is that fair to say, or is that have I got my facts wrong here? I mean, medieval might be the wrong word, but
so far as superstitions are concerned, if we go back to the upper Paleolithic world, you have this idea that everything has agency.
Okay.
And the shamans in the upper Paleolithic world would go on journeys to the other world, which might have been conceived as over the cave wall, which is one of the reasons why you have those immaculately conceived paintings of a bison, for example, with the back leg of the bison missing. Is it because the artist got lazy or didn't know that bison had 4 legs? No, it's because one leg of the bison is on the other side of the cave wall in the other world, the world to which the shaman went in order to get knowledge, to get gifts to bring back. And you had, I'm sure, as you have in modern hunter-gatherer societies, insofar as we haven't destroyed them, a clairvoyant relationship with animals and plants and even rocks. This is an animistic world full of spirits. I think what happened in the Neolithic world was that the orientation of the spiritual world became different. It had previously been horizontal. My relationship with the plant next door, my relationship with the rock across the valley. In the Neolithic, we got sky gods for the first time, which may have been identified with the sun, may have been identified with something more abstract. But that diluted the intensity of our relationship with the things on the same plane as us.
Yeah.
But I think, so far as superstitions are concerned, we have always been creatures with an idea that we ourselves are spiritual creatures and that everything else is to some extent a spiritual creature, until we get to the Enlightenment, to which we might come in the course of our conversation. Yes, superstition interpreted those relationships in slightly different ways in the various ages, but there was still that conviction that we weren't just made of stuff, and that other things weren't just made of stuff, and that there were other ways of communicating with them which weren't merely material, and that we endured. So in the Upper Paleolithic, it's perfectly clear that the agency of the human dead increased after their deaths. That they weren't just snuffed out, and I think that's a thought which continues through the Neolithic period as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
And
yeah,
then,
so superstition was reframed in the Neolithic period, but I think it had broadly the same content as it earlier had.
and then I think, I mean, we touched on, well, in the Neolithic, you visit a farmer, controlling vast, numbers of acres with a couple of with lots of equipment and a couple of workers, and then you also visit the slaughterhouse. I mean, both of those are pretty grim illustrations of where that where the subjection of nature to which was a characteristic of Neolithic life has got us to. I mean, they were particularly the slaughterhouse was a very, very grim, few pages of reading, I must say.
Yes, any upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherer going to any modern slaughterhouse would be appalled. I think they would use the language of blasphemy. They might not be clear about which god was being offended, but it would be the language of sacrilege. Yeah.
And then we move to the Enlightenment, and which is a very short period of the book for the reasons you mentioned earlier on. But you talk about, I mean, there were some great quotes when the chapter started, and it gives you a sense of, I guess, preview forthcoming attractions. When a well-packaged web of lies has been sold gradually to the masses over generations, the truth will seem utterly preposterous and its speaker a raving lunatic. And your dinner at your college, I guess, characterised that slightly different view.
Importantly, it wasn't my college.
So I know I wasn't going to ask you where it was, but
no dysfunctional conversations like that happen at my college, which is a very congenial place.
But it did fit. It did
real way place.
But it was also probably the most real. I mean, a lot of. I mean, the book was so immersive, but that. I mean, I could see that very, very easily, and I could hear that conversation, and I just was, presumably it was that almost verbatim, or was that a mixture of a number of conversations just to make the point?
It was a cocktail of a number of real conversations. So yes, there wasn't one single horrific high table night when those conversations happened. I've drawn fragments of conversations together from various places at various times and woven them together, but those conversations all happened.
But it was basically a clash of your perspective versus, and you had a very quiet, unfortunately, supporter who decided not to, the physiologist who remained quiet throughout the dinner, and then you were battling with the Shakespearean and with the I suppose the Professor Black, I think it was, right?
Yeah. And I've been criticised as creating straw men and putting words into their mouths, which I know I'll be able easily to respond to. But those words were said, and they're said day by day, moment by moment in the academy, without any embarrassment. So we do seem to have in the academy a real sort of set of hermetically sealed silos. People won't, particularly in biology, people won't let their feelings about their wife and their children and their own significance intrude into the way that they do their biology. They won't let the insights of particle physics intrude into the way they do their biology. They seem often to be far more attached to their old, stale teaching paradigms than they are to the truth of the matter, which is a very un-enlightenment way of looking at things. The Enlightenment is supposed to be about completely fearless inquiry. You go where the evidence leads, but that's not the way that a lot of modern biology happens. Here, you don't go where the evidence leads. You go where the old paradigm tells you must go. And then when you come home and you embrace your child, you know that the love that you feel for your child is not explicable by kin selection or reciprocal altruism, or any other ways. But when you go back into the lab at 9 o'clock the next day, you forget what happened when you were telling your child the bedtime story the night before. And it also troubles me that there is this big division between the poetic imagination, which has brought to a lot of research in physics on the distant borders of the subject on the one hand, and biology. So we know that time doesn't behave in the way that the biologists assume that it does. And we know that space-time is an illusion. We know that everything is, as a matter of fact, connected to everything else. We know that the electrons which are spinning in a molecule in my thigh are spinning in the way that they are because the electrons in a molecule on the far side of the universe are spinning that way, and vice versa. And we know that if anything has been close to another thing, it affects the behavior of that thing forever, instantaneously, and at whatever distance. And we know that the action of observers affects what is observed. You know, this is the basic Einsteinian premise. So these insights, which are trite in the world of physics, are often not imported into the world of biology. So biology seems to be stuck in the 19th century. And that's a shame, because fascinated though I am with the world of physics, the orbits of the planets, the behavior of subatomic particles, those things aren't as fascinating or significant to me as life. Mars is not as interesting to me as Mark Bidwell is, and certainly not as interesting as my children. So it's a shame that this almost mystical way of looking at the world, which is given to us by physics, is not imported into that part of the world, namely the biological world, which we inhabit.
Yeah, because I mean there are a number. I mean, so let's get specific, because one of the events that perhaps even, I don't know whether it triggered the event, but I mean you touched on it at the beginning, is your out-of-body experience several years ago, which I mean, how and then there were some other cameo events which you touch on in the book. There was a I think your father's transistor radio turned on long after his death, and then there was the story at the end, meeting the woman at a late night, I don't know, was it in Vietnam or Thailand, the woman who'd had a brain injury, a head injury, and was all electrical devices near her ceased to operate. I mean, there are a number of things that were pretty, hard to explain that you touch on in the book. A number of situations. How do you think about those, having been through your inquiry, or what lens would you look at those situations through?
As entirely unsurprising, given the web and weave of the cosmos as it now appears to me to be. And the thing which stops us from perceiving more of those sorts of things is not that they're not out there, but that we're not tuned in properly. And I think there was a time, the hunter-gatherer time, when we had the faculties to view these things as part of the natural world. So I don't think these are supernatural. I think these are natural, and that we have become atrophied and truncated. At the beginning of the Snow Leopard by Peter Matthieson, he uses an epigraph from René Rilke, which says something like, there is at bottom only one thing which is demanded of us, to have courage for the most strange, the most significant that may happen to us. That mankind has, in this sense, been cowardly, has done life endless harm. The experiences that are called visions, the whole so-called spirit world, all these things which are so close to us and so akin to us, have by daily parrying been so crowded out by life that the faculties with which we might have grasped them have atrophied. And that summarizes my position.
And presumably that was what was going through the minds of the physiologist at a dinner who decided not to say anything as you were.
No doubt, no doubt.
And I mean, we haven't quite got the order right, but I mean, you were. I think there's a quote here around. Maybe we go to the quote. Yes, shamans are central to any inquiry into human origins. And you touched on. I think you had an encounter with a shaman. And obviously, I think the original book that you referred to, "The Mind in the Cave," by David Lewis Williams, talks quite a lot about shamans as well. Can you say a bit more about that quote? I mean, how my understanding of shamans maybe it depends how it's a reflection of how I define shamans, because there are all sorts of shamans who probably don't call themselves shamans who we come across in our lives, but I mean. Today, most shamans are probably associated with people who lead people on sort of ayahuasca ceremonies in the Peruvian jungle and stuff. But what's your definition of, how do you define shamans, and why do you say they're so important to this inquiry into human origins?
So I see a shaman or a shaman as someone who shuttles between this plane on which we normally live and others in order to bring back some sort of information or some sort of gifts from that other world. So an intermediary, a priest of some sort, a bridge builder, a shuttler. And I think that shamans are connected with the ignition of modern human consciousness in the way that David Lewis Williams suggests, namely that shamans go to wherever it is they go to, some other plane of existence, and from that distant perspective, they look back at the world that they have left, and they get a perspective on that quotidian world, which gives them the objectivity to say that these creatures are discrete from one another in a way that they wouldn't otherwise have been. To see both individuation and connection in a way which hadn't previously been visible. And Lewis Williams devotes whole books to explaining exactly how that might have occurred, and it seems convincing to me. And as you've suggested, we have lots of modern examples of shamans. It may be that the best model of the shaman that we have is the model of Christ. So here is someone who, like an apprentice shaman, undergoes horrific torture and death, goes to another place, does some work there, and then comes back in order to deliver a benefit to the community. So that is a motif which is all of a piece with the way that shamanic cultures operate.
Interesting. I'm mindful of time. Can I just run through a couple of other unrelated questions? Well, not unrelated, but I mean they might feel unrelated. But coal tar soap appears quite frequently in the book. What does that mean? I mean, and the reason I ask is because I mean, having read it, I made a note to actually go and buy some when I'm next in the UK, because it does have a, it's got a very, I responded very viscerally to the idea of it just because of the smell, and it sends me deep back into my childhood. What does it mean for you, and why did you include it on several occasions?
My father used it. He was religiously devoted to it. So in the book, the constant reappearance of the smell of cold tar soap was an indication that my father was there in some way. Like you, it was because my father used it, tied up with my childhood. So perhaps this wasn't ghostly cold tar soap. Maybe this was some harking back to childhood where, as we've discussed, I knew more about the way things really are than I do now. I'm sure any half-competent psychoanalyst could have a field day with my cold tar soap.
Well, I was going to. The next question relating to that. I mean, I think there's a quote here. Being a, I'm going to maybe not get it quite right, but being a proper father, you articulated as sending him, your son, into the cold to fast and to fear and to learn his story. And then the second piece to this, being a proper son is to wear his father's bones around his neck. Can you, we haven't touched on story, but I think it's a really important part of this when we come to, some of the subsequent insights, if you like. But can you say a little bit about being a proper father? Because I mean, that was obviously, you wrote those words, but also it was a theme coming throughout the book, and also your relationship with your father.
Yes. So I think I'm a very possessive father. I have six children, and I'm very, very bad at letting them go. I'm conscious that my interest in these hunter-gatherer traditions is wholly at odds with the way that I hang on jealously to my children, because we don't have any more proper rites of passage. We have a rite of passage for teenagers which is no more significant and no more dignifying than giving them their first iPhone. And they will work out their own rites of passage by giving and drinking cider in a bus shelter. Yeah. And we're worth more than that. You talked about story, and I think that any story, as any writer's workshop will tell you, needs to be signposted, and it needs to move through time in a way which makes some coherent sense. Things have to happen. Mere self-referential streams of consciousness are extremely boring, and if our stories as human individuals are just homogeneous, undifferentiated sacks of sensation, we're not going to be very interesting or very fulfilled people. And rites of passage play an important part, it would seem to me, in the individual human story. So there are some obvious ones which are imposed by our biology, but marriage, death, and so on. But there should be others too, because we have a duty to shape our lives in accordance with what we know to be right and dignified. So that was what I was talking about when I was talking about wanting to send my own beloved son Tom out to find out the sort of person he is and will be.
And can I interrupt you? There's a very poignant piece where he asks you to tell me a story, Dad, and you didn't have one. How would you answer that story today? That question today? What would be the answer to Tom?
I would tell him the whole story that I relate in being a human, namely a story which parallels the biblical one, actually, doesn't it? Although I didn't think of it like this at the time. So one of relative Eden, when we had a proper relationship with the non-human world, and therefore with ourselves, because we're part of this non-human world as well. A fall when we enter the Neolithic period, a further fall when in the Enlightenment we conceive the world as a desouled place, we reconceive it as a machine and ourselves demeaningly as mere parts in a machine, but as a story in which we have the agency to turn the clock back and push the clock forward in a way which allows us to learn the lessons of the last 45,000 years or so.
And is that the hero's journey or not? I mean, how different is that from Campbell's hero? I'm wondering whether because I mean, there's also
it is similar, and I think that all humans are heroes. In the book, I'm conscious, and I think I apologise for it at the end, for coming over as slightly misanthropic, and always denigrating everything which has happened since the Neolithic dawn. But that is a disappointment which springs from my conviction that we are extraordinary creatures with immense possibilities, and that the disappointment lies in the fact that we don't realise those possibilities. But we can and must, and I increasingly see, particularly in people of the generation below us, realising that the stories that we have told them about the world and about their place in it are just not up to the job. They know that they're bigger and better and more lasting and more significant than we tell them that they are. That they are not just Homo economicus. That they are not just blobs of matter. That they're more than that. And so that the desperate search for a new story is what surely characterises everything which is written in modern literature, everything which produces the tensions in modern politics, although it often takes a dramatically wrong turn. Nationalism is pathetic pastiche of the story that we should be telling about ourselves. But at its core, there is a desire to relate more intimately to the land, to the place, to other human beings in a way in which we once did. Yes, it's taken a horribly perverted form in the modern political arena, but the basic instinct is an old and potentially redeeming one if we direct it right.
Yeah. Are you okay? Have you got a few more minutes? I've got a few more questions, but I'm aware of time.
Yes.
So I mean,
I'm being very long-winded.
No, not at all. Because I mean, there's so much more that I wanted to cover, but I won't take too much of your time. But I mean, I quote, there were two pieces to the quote, and I think I might have interrupted you. Being a proper father, and then being a proper son.
So your father's bones are around your neck. So certainly in the Neolithic, and almost certainly earlier than that, people would carry their ancestors' bones around with them when they went on their journeys, or when they went out into the fields to tend their goats. It was an acknowledgement of the continuity that we biologically have and culturally have, and it was an acknowledgement of the continuing presence of the past. The most powerful books are those which talk about human beings as able to tune into a past which is still there in the trees, in the mountains, in the rocks, and which in some ways we can access, which in some way affect the way that we do things. And having your father's knuckle bones and a necklace round your neck is just a very extreme way of doing that, an extreme way of acknowledging that you're part of a community of the dead now, and I expect that mitigates the terror of one's own biological death too. Lots of the great mystics have talked about the necessity to live one's death now in order to draw the teeth with which it would ultimately bite you.
Brilliant, brilliant. So can we? I mean, there's a lot more, but if we close now with this part. My question, I guess, is what's been the response of the book? What the response to the book? And I suppose I'm wondering, partly the physiologist. How many physiologists have come up to you in the street? How much has this book given people confidence to share with you some of their experiences that might sound a little bit supernatural, a little bit? I mean, how have people responded in the street, or perhaps online to the book in that context? I was interested in that, Charles. What's been your experience?
Yeah. So, and I hope, and I've got some reason for saying this, I hope that it has encouraged some people to come out as mystics, which is what I think all human beings really are. Mm-hmm. So to say on a page that you have a feeling that your dead father is there, and to put that thought in the same chapter as a book about as some thoughts about the Bohr-Einstein debate, makes it respectable to say things about our intuitions which we'd otherwise feel embarrassed about uttering. So that has happened.
It has. Yeah, because I mean, I think there were a number of things in the book that certainly triggered memories for me personally about my parents, about my my past. And obviously, then the next question is, well, what steps can I take as a parent to ensure, what does this mean for me as a parent to ensure I, do my best to be a good parent? So there were a number of things that were kind of resonated for me on a very personal level, and I guess I'm not. You're saying I'm not unique in that sense. I think you also say, where is it? You're not trying to, there is a number of there's a number of questions that you're not trying to answer about how to improve one's state. But when we spoke before this meeting, before this call, you said, I asked you the question, what's changed most for you? Can you share that? And what are the other? So what are you doing differently today as a result of your? What have you stopped doing, and maybe what have you started doing as a result of your inquiry? And any other insights? We touched on the need for a new story, for instance. But I'm interested in what's the so what from your work in this book.
Well, the first observation is, which came most forcibly from being a beast rather than being a human, but was reinforced, particularly by the upper Paleolithic phase of being a human, and that is to acknowledge our embeddedness in the non-human world. So the biologist and philosopher David Abraham says that there are only relatively unwild places. So a shopping mall, if you walk through it with your senses properly switched on, is a wild place, and we should approach it and respect it and feel at home there, being wild creatures ourselves, in a way that we might not otherwise feel. A related observation is to acknowledge that although we're part of the natural world, we are dramatically special parts of it. So we do have a de facto sovereignty over the natural world, which has been abused in the most horrific ways, and that acknowledgement should lead us to try to direct our sovereignty right. If we have power in our hands, as we do have, and we have the relationship with the natural world, which we know we do have, let's marry those two together in a way which isn't frankly psychopathic, in a way which it often is in our modern ways of living. But as you've hinted, the desperate quest for story is behind all this. Mm-hmm. Why are we in such a mess, politically, economically, ecologically? It's because we don't have a right story. You know, we've inherited a pastiche of the Enlightenment view of the world, which, as we were discussing, conceives the world as a machine, and there's nothing obviously immoral about smashing up a machine. Mm-hmm. There is something obviously immoral about desouling something, about killing something which is alive. If we acknowledge the aliveness of the world, realizing that the whole is far greater than some of the parts, surely we will behave towards it in a more compassionate way. I think there are ways of working more strenuously at our empathy for one another and for the non-human world. And empathy is like anything else. The harder you work at it, the better you get at it. So doing an elaborate piece of zoological method acting, like I did in Being a Beast, or anthropological, archaeological method acting, like I did in Being a Human, might, and I hope it did for me, I have to ask my wife whether it really worked, but I hope it increased my own empathy muscles. Yeah. To make me a slightly less unsatisfactory husband and father and friend. Yeah. So yeah, lots of lessons. Yeah. But the overall thing that came through to me was, what an epic story. Let's live up to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd also say what an epic story you wrote. I mean, the travel journey of this, that characterized in this book was epic as well. So I mean, I appreciate, within the comments of what you said, I'd like to share my appreciation, because it has been a fantastic read and hugely I won't say challenging, but it really does force you to actually take a long, hard look at a lot of what one does as a human, as a father, as a husband, as a friend. And yeah, there aren't many easy answers out there, but it's been fascinating for me. I really have enjoyed it, I must say.
Well, thank you so very much, Mark.
So a couple of final questions, which I always end my interviews with, if you don't mind. Couple more minutes, if that's okay, Charles. What have you changed your mind about recently?
I've changed my mind about my ability to affect anything politically. So I now have a rule of complete fast from the news. I avert my head whenever I pass a newsagent so that I don't see the headlines. I don't have the conceit that I can do anything about it, and I know that to continue with that conceit does terrible things to my mental health. So I'm working on how to be politically disengaged in that sense, while at the same time being politically more engaged in the sense in which it's possible to make a difference. So I have become much less loudly grandiose about how the world should change, and much more local and tea making and and small scale. So that's the big thing.
Okay. Second question, and I mean, I'm particularly interested in this as well because when I spoke to you the other day, you were saying you've just come back from a very remote visit to Scotland. I think in the book you jump on a boat and go down and hang out with a bunch of people at a port in Spain. But my question is, where do you go to get fresh perspectives?
That's very easy. I go to Greece.
Go to Greece.
So we're very fortunate. We have a house in a very remote part in southern Greece. It's an ungoverned and ungovernable place, and the muses are there in a way that they simply aren't here in Oxford, which I also love. And it's poised right on the edge of Europe. It's poised right on the edge of lots of other notions and places too. It's poised on the edge of Greece. It's poised on the edge of Europe. It's poised on the edge of modernity. It's poised on the edge of the Western way of looking at things. I think it's part of the Greek genius that because from almost anywhere in Greece you can see an edge, you can see the sea, at least if you stand on a stepladder. So that the whole country is characterized by edges and edginess. There's a sort of metaphysical uncertainty in the whole of the Greek way of life, which produces a sort of poise, which I find really inspiring. These are people who live rather like people who have their father's knuckles on their with the constant knowledge of their own mortality, and that produces both a seriousness and a serious levity, the cocktail of which is very intoxicating. Talking about bones, and they dig up their parents a year after they have died and wash their bones in their homemade wine before putting them in a box and coming to pray over them on the date of their death every year. And that sounds mawkish, but it brings to the business of their Homeric feasting a sort of intensity which I find very exciting and very liberating, and in accord with what I understand human beings to be. And so I can write fantastically more words per unit time when I'm there than when I'm in Greece than I am in Oxford. And I also like the homemade wine, which is €1 a litre.
I'll argue with that. And then the final question: what's been your biggest failure or disappointment, and what have you learned from that?
Again, a really easy question. So I never found a language in which to talk to my parents. So we were, although we love one another very much, continually at cross purposes. We could never connect at the level that we wanted to. We were never able to articulate in language our love for one another. And I wish that I had worked harder at finding a common language. And this experience has led me to doubt the validity of language itself, which is one of the themes that I explore in Being a Human, and to preference non-linguistic ways of relationship, and not just relationship, but of knowing. So that's been the most influential thing, and the most disappointing, and the most regretted thing.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much for being so open and also spending your time to, share your, put up with my questions and talk about your journey. I mean, as I say, I loved it. I'm hoping we can meet in person. I know we spoke that I'm going to be spending some time in the UK in the next few months, so perhaps we can.
Please be in touch. Thank you so much for your interest in this book, and yes, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, Mark. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.